Penn's Valley of Center County off of Route 192, Penn's Caves has operated as a tourist attraction since 1885. At the site, the local legend of the Seneca princess Nittany is recounted. A written copy of this is in the history folder, but the highlights are star-crossed lovers who are kept apart by cultural convention on the native side. Before we get started in competing historical narratives, let's take a look at this phrase that ends the account. In central Pennsylvania, we honor the beautiful Indian maiden Nittany by bestowing her name on Nittany Mountain. The use of place names is not done to honor the native inhabitants who lived in the area. All nations express their identity in terms that bind them and lend them sovereignty in time and space. This gives a sense of centrality to the people in the world. We see this in the Romans borrowing from the Greeks, the Americans borrowing from the Romans and other historic peoples, as well as from native peoples in order to express a distinction from England. The native peoples themselves did this. Lenape in Algonquin means the original people. So it's nothing to feel bad about, everyone does it, but let's not pretend ourselves that we are honoring others when in fact we are honoring ourselves. So how does the way that the Penn's Caves history is interpreted impact our understanding of the lives of Native American people who lived in this area? A few narratives like the one written up at Penn's Caves, a handful of place names, some archaeological sites, and the occasional account in the annals of our historical societies are all that remain of the indigenous inhabitants of central Pennsylvania. Given the lack of a current indigenous presence, the few narratives like this might be all that most residents would ever know of the Native Americans that preceded us. Looking at this account, a story of star-crossed lovers unable to be together makes for an appealing narrative, but a poor history. What's offered is a story of two peoples, a story of an intrepid and generous white explorer who would gladly form a family with natives if only their customs would allow. Whatever the historical accuracy of this account, it certainly is a poor synecdoche for the relationship between natives and the colonists. Here is another account, which is no doubt fraught with inaccuracies of its own, but it might be nearer to the truth. It's not a story of two peoples, but of many. We'll read all the white settlers as one, which does a disservice to the class and nationality differences among the settlers, but that's a subject for a different video. On the native side, there were many different groups, with profound divisions running through the Iroquois and Algonquin language groups that defined historical and political rivalries. Until the 1670s, the Susquehannock dominated the area that includes Center County. This Iroquoian-speaking people warred both with other Iroquois to the north and turned the Lenape to the east into a tributary. They were early middlemen in the fur trade through which they gained great wealth and access to firearms. Their trade with Europeans, the source of their wealth, was also the cause of their downfall, as disease contracted through trade decimated their population, and they were done as a power by the late 17th century. About that time, many of the Iroquois of New York went on a rampage of territorial expansion. The Seneca tribe of the Iroquois, in particular, used captives captured through war as a way to boost their population ravaged by disease brought by the colonists. This expansion was fought against Algonquin-speaking neighbors, but also other Iroquois speakers such as the Susquehannock, and even westward into the Ohio River Valley. The Seneca tribe took over control of central Pennsylvania by 1675. The successful Iroquois expansion rewrote the native political power base of the Northeast. In order to fill the power vacuum left by the exit of the Susquehannocks, the Iroquois welcomed other tribes displaced by colonial settlement and arranged them geographically as a defensive barrier between the Iroquois land and white settlements. This included the Conoys from Virginia, the Nanticokes from Maryland, and even the Tuscaroras from North Carolina. While this barrier served as a defensive presence on the Iroquois' southern border, the collective native diaspora did not linger long. By the time white settlers arrived in Center County, the echoes of the Iroquois political structure were still around, as well as a smattering of Algonquin-speaking refugees fleeing the colonial push west. All told, however, Center County was only sparsely populated with a native population, though the natives that were here were diverse in their cultural roots, political affiliations, and disposition to white expansion. We can see this heterogeneity in a look at the three famous native peoples who are enshrined in Center County place names. Nittany was supposedly a Seneca princess, a people who had a history of working first with the Dutch and then the English, but famously hated the French, especially after the French governor of Quebec burned down the Seneca capital. In contrast, Chief Wapelani, or Bald Eagle, was an Algonquin-speaking Lenape elder, whose main residence was in Milesburg about 50 years after the events of the Nittany legend. His raids on American expansion come as no surprise, since he is part of the Lenape diaspora ever pushed westward, a removal formalized by the Treaty of Easton in 1758. A generation before Chief Bald Eagle was a prominent figure in central Pennsylvania, Chief Logan spent time administering the region for Iroquois interests. He had a settlement in Mingoville, but had left by 1770, so he overlapped with the first formal land surveyors of Penn's Valley for about only 4 years. Famously a friend of European colonists, Chief Logan changed his allegiance after he moved west and his family was murdered by Virginia colonists in the Yellow Creek Massacre. By the time of the Revolutionary War, he was fighting against the Americans, like Chief Bald Eagle. We see a history of our land not as a simple love story of two peoples where the circumstances just didn't work out, but as a complicated weave of many peoples, languages, values, and customs, worked out over bloody generations and against a backdrop of rampant disease and the relentless push of colonists from the East. Perhaps Chief Logan's words in 1774 are a better reminder of our tumultuous past. I appealed to any white man to say, if ever he entered Logan's cabin hungry, and he gave him not meat. If ever he came cold and naked, and he clothed him not. During the course of the last long and bloody war, Logan remained idle in his cabin and advocated for peace. Such was my love for the whites that my countrymen pointed as they passed, and said, Logan is the friend of the white men. I even thought to live with you, but for the injuries of one man. Colonel Creasp, in the last spring, in cold blood and unprovoked, murdered all the relations of Logan, not sparing even my women and children. There runs not a drop of my blood in the veins of any living creature. This has called on me for revenge, and I have sought it. I have killed many. I have fully glutted my vengeance. For my country I rejoice at the beams of peace. But do not harbor a thought that mine is the joy of fear. Logan never felt fear. He will not turn on his heel to save his life. Who is there to mourn for Logan? Not one.